Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 87. Steve Niedervalier, Part 1. Steve had been thoroughly amused by Tony in sort of time. He was pretty sure Tony wouldn't appreciate the comparison, but he really was like Howard in some ways, especially when he got all excited about tech. The trip had also been eye-opening as all heck. It was one thing to know that Tony was an inventor and a businessman. It was another entirely to see him in what was basically his elements. Now, more than ever, Steve was convinced that a big chunk of the way Tony presented himself to the public was, well, basically the difference between Captain America and Steve Rogers. Same basic person, really, but one of them was really exaggerated. At any rate, Tony had managed to wrap up a tentative deal with Thorgine. Thorgine would be visiting Earth in about 2 weeks' time to see hydroponics in action, as that was the main sticking point of the contract for the ships. If he liked what he saw, they'd have a deal and construction would start immediately. If not, they'd have to figure out another means of payment, but Steve didn't think that would be too difficult with Thorgine on Earth, where they could show him what they had available. That done, they'd returned briefly to Asgard to get some horses. Svartalfheim was the only realm that tolerated strangers teleporting around. Mostly, Steve figured, because their cities were miles underground and heavily protected. The other realms had a tendency to shoot strangers first and ask questions later if they popped up out of nowhere, according to Loki, who was in a position to know. Steve was just grateful that Asgardian horses were smarter than their Earth counterparts. Both he and Tony were city boys. Steve had actually never even seen a horse in person until the war, when they'd run across one every now and again in the country. He had no idea if Tony had ever been near one, but the wide-eyed look and slightly nervous handling said no. Asta was basically steering herself, as Steve had no real idea how to guide a horse and didn't want to hurt her by accident. From the looks of things, Berger and Tony were doing the same. That said, Bucky, well, soldier, really. Steve knew it wasn't Bucky, not really, not yet. He just had to keep reminding himself to use soldier rather than Bucky. Anyway, Soldier was handling his horse like he'd been born on a horse. Given that Bucky had been every bit the city boy that Steve had been, it was more than a little jarring to see. Asta, the horse Thor chose for Steve, was a gorgeous Palomino mare with a burnished, almost gold coat and very close to pure white mane and tail. Berger, Tony's horse, was also a mare, but a chestnut with a coat, mane, and tail as close to the red of Tony's suit as Steve figured a horse could get. Steve was absolutely not betting on Thor deliberately choosing Berger based on that alone. Very possibly abetted by Loki if the amused look Loki had been sporting was anything to go by. Ira was a chestnut mare as well, but more brown and less red than Berger, and she had a wide white stripe down her face and 2 white socks on her back legs, unlike the other two, who didn't have any white markings. Niedervalier was kind of stunning, but definitely a lot like the African savanna from what Steve had seen of it on television. Lots of wide open space, really tall grass. It reached Asta's shoulder most places, the color of wheat, and a handful of trees and bushes scattered about. The area immediately around the Bifrost landing zone was pretty much devoid of life, which only made sense. Steve figured that animals had run for the horizon the moment the Bifrost started heading for the ground here. They'd been riding for an hour when the first of the wildlife finally came into view as they topped a small hill. Steve just sort of stared for a moment before double-checking that his shield was still on his back. From the numbers he was seeing, he was guessing the animals were the Niedervalier equivalent to wildebeest. Except these were about the size of a rhinoceros, and about as heavily armored. They weren't as fat as rhinos tended to be, and didn't have a horn on the nose. They had 2 horns, one just above each eye, that stuck more or less straight out and could easily be used to skewer a predator if they charged with their heads down. Interestingly, instead of being gray, which some of the bigger prey species on Earth tended towards, elephants, hippos, and rhinos, these guys were the golden tan of a lion with a relatively thin coat over their armor, allowing them to sort of blend in with the grasses. Worse, there were some truly huge carnivores mostly hidden in the grass at an angle to the four of them in a depression. Steve could just make out ears, eyes, and noses. Given how tall the grass was, and how big the prey was, the carnivores had to be pretty big. Lions didn't mess with rhinos as a general rule, from what Steve had learned, so he was guessing that whatever carnivore that was bigger than a lion, even if he couldn't see enough to tell. "Do we go around?" Steve asked Thor, then glanced at Soldier to see how he was doing. He was definitely on alert, staring at the animals and looking like he'd kick Iera into a run if anything even looked like it might happen. That said, he was surprisingly calm.
"In part," Thor said. "The herd is far too large to go around completely, but we shall go in that direction."
He pointed towards the carnivores.
"I perceive some local predators on the hunt. It will be safer for us closer to them than further away and potentially in the path of the stampede that will cause."
"Yeah, with the size of those, totally agree," Tony said. They worked their way around the herd and well behind the predators that were, now they weren't on a rise, completely invisible. The herd pretty much ignored them, hardly a surprise. Steve didn't think the five of them looked like any threat to them when they were used to being hunted by huge predators and very probably the native Valir, who were Hulk-sized. They'd gotten maybe about 50 years beyond the depression where the predators had been hiding when they exploded out of cover heading away from their group, sending the herd scattering in all directions. Because they were so close to the depression, the stampede didn't really bother their group. Steve did a triple take at the carnivores as they became visible above the grass. Now they weren't hunkered down. Because they were saber-toothed cats! Or looked enough like them to fool Steve at any rate. Like the rhino-alikes, they were a golden tan, but dappled with darker and lighter colors in an irregular pattern to help them blend into the grass better. They were also about twice the size of a lion, as far as Steve could tell. They also startled the heck out of Soldier, who made an aborted a motion like he was bringing a gun he didn't have to bear on the cats. What was really interesting was that after the initial startled bolt, and a lot of startled bellowing, some of the rhino-alikes whipped around and faced the cats, heads down and standing shoulder to shoulder, forming a blockade and allowing the bulk of the herd to get clear, while the cats had to deal with them. Their group didn't stick around long enough to see how that played out, but Steve didn't envy the cats one bit. That did not look like relatively easy hunting. The scary part was that the animals Steve spotted got bigger from there. The next critter they saw was just plain ugly. They were the size of an elephant, but looked more like a bison. They had a huge shoulder hump, then a long slope down to the hind end, which was about 6 feet off the ground, compared to about 12 for the shoulder proper, and 14 for the hump, and a big antlered head. The antlers were like a moose's, big wide hunks of bone or whatever that spread quite a bit wider than the animal itself. Unlike the furry saber-toothed cats and rhino-alikes, these things had putrid green-colored scaled armor like an alligator and no fur that Steve could see.
"Bilge snipe," Thor rumbled. "We must take care. They stampede easily."
And at that size, that would be really bad for anything in their path, Tony said, eyeballing the creatures with concern. They'd had the horses at what Steve assumed was a normal walking pace for them, but now they slowed down to nearly a crawl in an effort to not trigger a stampede. Half the herd watched them, turning to do so, and snorted and stamped their feet, eyes visibly rolling in their sockets. Somehow they managed to get to the far side of the herd without triggering a stampede, and Steve breathed a sigh of relief. There were smaller animals, too. If by smaller, you meant roughly the size of a bear. Actually, Steve was pretty sure they were bears, because he couldn't see any obvious differences between them and earth bears at a glance. They ran across 2 more groups of predators, something the size of a lion, but with the sleek, lean look Steve associated with cheetahs and greyhounds. He didn't get much of a look at them because they'd been mid-hunt on something the size of a water buffalo, but also with the lean, sleek lines of something really fast, rather than being heavy and armored. And then there were the birds. As befit a world with prey animals as big as Steve had seen, they had some huge birds, with the bald head Steve associated with carrion eaters. Steve was pretty sure they could carry any of the 4 people in their group off without a problem if they wanted to. 15 to 20 foot wingspans easily, and bodies to match. The others were harder to see as they zoomed by overhead, heading off to wherever, rather than gliding slowly around looking for leftovers. Still, all on the big side. What weirded Steve out, though, was the fact that he didn't see any bugs. Nothing analogous to a mosquito, bee, ant. Nothing. He didn't quite know what to think of that. Was it late in the year, close to winter, and the bugs had all either died off or gone into hibernation or something? Or did this world have a different way of dealing with the stuff bugs dealt with? He had no idea. Finally, sometime around dinner time, they topped another low hill and the lone city on the planet came into view. Given their trip here, and what they'd been told of the lives the Nidavellir preferred to lead, Steve had been half expecting a tent city. But he'd been wrong. The city was surrounded by a very high, easily 50-foot, stone wall, with closely spaced out and down, at about a 45-degree angle, facing spikes along the very top edge, probably to discourage climbing predators. When they got to the gate, Steve noticed the wall was a good 20 feet thick, which really only made sense when you had animals the size of the ones he'd seen wandering around. Of course, the animals would avoid the city under normal circumstances, but stampeding animals didn't tend to pay attention to what was in their path in their panic to get away from what was behind them, and sick or injured animals, especially predators, might be tempted to try the city as an apparently easier source of food. The Nidavellir, rather like the dwarves, seemed to have a thing for bright colors. The walls and roofs of the buildings were all bright, frequently clashing colors. Steve suspected paint because the buildings looked to be made of stone blocks like the wall. Stone didn't come in most of the colors he was seeing on Earth. If they came in those colors here, he was really going to wonder about the place. The Nidavellir themselves, well, very, very like Hulk, really. Except not green. Or at least not that green, anyway, as Steve spotted folks with a green tint to their skin. Mid to light browns, tans, and dull greens seemed to be the predominant skin colors, and browns and blondes the predominant hair color. The green skin tones aside, they just looked like oversized humans to Steve. If they ever got Hulk to a point where he could reliably interact with people outside of their small group, basically, he'd love it here. Everything was him-sized. It sort of made Steve a little nostalgic because he kind of felt like he was back in his old body a little. Interestingly, none of the buildings were multi-storied. Steve wasn't sure why that was. It could be as simple as the Nidavellir simply not needing multi-story buildings when they had the room to spread out. Or maybe they didn't like heights or something. The palace didn't look like a palace to Steve's eyes. It just looked like every building around it. Maybe a tiny bit bigger, but that was it. Which he guessed made sense. If you can't tell the palace at a glance, finding the ruler and their family becomes a lot harder if you're an invader. The other thing Steve noticed was that the Nidavellir didn't seem to go in much for armor. Again, made sense. It'd be of little use against the animals of the realm, and any invaders were very probably going to be smaller and weaker, so armor wasn't a priority. They dismounted outside the palace, and a native appeared to take their horses who knew where without a word. The inside of the palace proved to be as colorful as the outside. They walked down a surprisingly short corridor to the only door being guarded, and were let in by the guards. The throne room was absolutely tiny compared to Asgard and even Svartalfheim's throne rooms. It was all of about 50 feet by 50 feet. Steve figured that any big announcements or the like had to be done outdoors because you'd get maybe a dozen Nidavellir in here before it got crowded. Queen Bestla was sitting in a sturdy chair at the far end of the room. Queen Bestla turned out to have a skin color that rode the line between light brown and tan. Whatever hair color she'd once had, it was now a sort of washed-out gray. Older she might be, but her eyes were still sharp and clear, and Steve devoutly hoped she wasn't Odin's contemporary in every category. They could ill afford a realm with a poor leader at the helm. She was dressed in a flowing sapphire blue gown. Steve didn't see anything like a crown, nor did he see anything that might be the realm's scepter or their defensive weapon. Bestla got to her feet as they approached. "Prince Loki,"
It is good to see you again. Rumor of your death reached us a few months past. The Asgardian ambassador did say you lived when he arrived a week or so ago, but I do not trust to gossip.
Loki came forward and bowed respectfully.
I must admit the rumors of my demise came closer to being true than I would like, he admitted. May I make known to you Crown Prince Thor of Asgard?
Bestla looked Thor up and down. Then she did something that made Steve choke on an unexpected laugh. She shook a finger at him.
I've heard tales of your intemperate actions, Prince Thor, and from more sources than your brother. You will behave yourself in my realm.
Thor actually blushed.
I shall, Queen Bestla. If it eases you, I have recently begun to understand how poorly I have been behaving, and begun to try to correct it.